Hello everyone and welcome back to the flight deck. In the next series of videos we're going to take a look at the new Asobo Ju-52 and how I fly it. We're going to look at the prep, startup, taxi, takeoff, cruise on a short flight, and then the landing and shutdown. We're here in Vienna. We're going to fly a quick flight down to Graz in the southwest, and we're going to just go over some of the things you need to do to be able to fly the airplane. First thing to note, this is the retrofitted Ju-52, not the original cockpit layout. The reason for that is I'm still learning the controls, and the original is all in German, and it's a little difficult to get a grip on until you kind of know the airplane. So we're going to be using the retrofitted, more modern cockpit where the instrumentation is a little bit more understandable and familiar. So let's hop on board the aircraft and we can start with the cockpit prep and getting it ready to go. Alright, we're here on board the airplane, and as you can see the instrumentation is fairly familiar, if not completely familiar in layout. At least we can recognize what a lot of the instrumentation is. So first thing I'm going to do is open up the windows, get a little bit of air in here, and it also has a very nice sunroof type of place to open up there. We're also going to get rid of the yoke just to get that out of the way so we can see what we're doing. So here we have the typical layout. We have the pilot's instruments, we have the general engine instruments in the center and standby flight instruments. We have the co-pilot's instruments. We have some of the carb heat and hydraulics down here. We have the engine systems, lighting, the radios, and on the back here we have the electronics or electrics, and that's pretty much all we're going to need. And we'll go over each section as we get to it and as there's things we need to do. So first thing we're going to do inside the airplane is take a look at our fuel gauges, and the fuel gauges are located out on the wings. These are old style, probably dipped right into the tanks. So here's our fuel gauge on the left side, and there's 12 and it comes all the way around to 0, and you can see our little fuel gauge here. It's kind of down towards the 8, and so we're just over halfway on the fuel for this tank. This is the engine oil. When we're running, it'll sit, as long as it's in the green, we have enough oil in the engine. If we go back up to the front, here's the middle engine, and we can come over to the other side, and if we look out this way, we can see over here we have the same layout, engine oil, and then the fuel tank on the left hand side of the airplane. So our fuel's where we expect it to be, and engine oil is set in the position it's in because the engines aren't running. So to get the aircraft turned on, we're going to come over here to the first officer's seat. We're going to turn on the compartment blower, and we're going to turn on the battery 1 and 2. So our batteries are now on. We're now going to go to the back panel. We're going to make sure our battery, our bus 1 is on battery, our bus 2 is on battery, and our services are on battery bus 1, which they are, so that is all fine. You can see we have a slight bit of change in the needles there, but we're also drawing for the back of the airplane. So that's the engine, the aircraft powered up. We can come down to here on our exterior lights now. We can turn on our nav light with one click here, and our anti-collision light can come on. And if we go outside, see our anti-collision light is flashing, and we have our green nav light. We'll have the red on the other side, and I don't know if this has a belly light or not, but she's up there and looking good. So now we can start getting ready for engine start as everybody is on board. So we're going to come around to the back electrical panel again. Over here is our engine switches. So this is for sending the electrical power to the engines for engine start. So we're going to turn them all on and close the covers. And we are ready for engine start. So this is what we need for the engine start. Now, my one complaint about this in the aircraft is that the sounds are a little bit low for what they should be, but we should be good. So, fuel tank selector. We have left tank, right tank, and both. I'm going to leave it on both. That is fine. We can come down to here. For our interior lights, we can turn on the no smoking. We'll turn on the fasten seatbelt. We will turn on the emergency exit lights. Make sure they are armed and ready to go. Pitot heats are off at the moment. Parking brake is on, and that is all we need there. So we're going to start this in the sequence of engine 3, which is the right-hand engine, engine 1, the left-hand engine, and the center engine, engine 2 last. So first thing we want to do is come over to the side of the first officer's seat, and we're going to undo the wobble pump, and we're going to give it about 8 pumps. It's 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. We're going to leave it unhooked in case we need it. Next thing we're going to do, we're going to turn on the fuel pump. We're going to turn on the hydraulic pump. We're going to come over to the starter safety here, and we're going to activate the starter. That means that she'll now crank the engines. These are your prop controls. We're going to make sure that they're all in low RPM, which they are. That's where we want them. We're going to come down here to the selector. Here we're going to go to start. That's 2 notches down. We'll give it a slight crack on the throttle, and we're going to bring the mixtures up on all 3 to idle cutoff. And when we hit start, the engine will crank, and then we're going to take the mixture all the way down into rich. So we'll come up here to the starter. That's the left mag, right mag, both, and one more click will crank the starter. You can hear it going. Mixture goes all the way down. I do gotta say, the sounds are low, but they sound really good. That's a really good start, and she's slowly gonna wind itself up. So that's coming up, so this will now go to run. Mag is on both, everything is good. We'll leave it at 600 RPM for a minute. Just let it settle in. We'll go over to the right engine, or the left engine. RPMs are low. Over to start. Mixture's all the way up. And 1, 2, 3. We're on both on the mags. One more click and she will start. There she goes. Mixture's all the way rich. Good start. So we'll take that one to run. Now what we're going to do, since engine 3 has been running for a minute, we'll bring that engine up slightly. We're going to bring the engine up to about 1,000 RPM. So we're going to bring the manifold pressure up to just about 14 inches on the manifold pressure. We'll let the right hand or left hand engine run for a minute while we start the center engine. So again, props all the way to low. Click over the lever. Start. Mixtures all the way up. We'll give it a slight crack on the fuel, and same thing. All the way to the right for start. And there we go. So we can now bring up the other engine. About 14. bring you all the way down to run. We'll give it a second to start warming up as well. There we go. All 3 engines are up and running. So we can bring up the center engine. We'll get them all just around 1,000 RPM. Make sure that the mixtures are rich for all of them. There we go. It's a little bit easier when you're on an angle. And what we can do now is go back to our starter safety. We can engage the safety, close the cap, since the engines are all up and running. So these are our engine gauges. On the top we have our RPMs. On the bottom we have our manifold pressures. Over here we have our oil pressure, which are now all up in the green, which is where we want them. We have our oil temperatures. You can see they're slowly coming up. And our fuel pressures, they're low because the engines are at idle. And that's why we have the fuel pump on. We'll turn that off once we're in the air. And here's our cylinder head temperatures located here. One more over here, we have the hydraulic bypass valve here. We have our exhaust gas temperatures, which you'd use for leaning. I'm going to tell you a trick I use for that. We have our carb temperatures. This is for carb ice, and then we have carb heat. Here, it's a little hand crank. It introduces warm air from the exhaust shroud into the carburetor to melt any ice that builds up there. For the instrument panel, we have the standard instruments. We have our artificial horizon, our airspeed, our altitude. Altitude is in feet on this retrofit. In the original 1938 cockpit, it's in meters. Vertical speed, we have our HSI here with a needle. Then we have our gauge here. This is our VOR ADF indicating needles. And we also have a very basic DME down here we're going to be using as well. We have a couple light switches here and there for cockpit lighting. And over here, we have our flap indicator. We have our trim indicator. Our trim wheel is located right here beside the seat. So it'd be very handy if you're just sitting there to reach down and roll the trim wheel. And that's about it. So you can see here on the front, the oil pressure gauge is now showing our oil level is there. When we're in flight, it'll be down about here as the oil starts to thin out and gets circulated around the engine. But everything's up and running. And we should be in a position where we are ready to taxi. So what we're going to do is we're going to taxi out here. As I mentioned, we're here at Vienna's airport, and we're going to be taking off here just from over here on runway 29er. And our destination airport is pretty much off that way at the foothills of the Alps. So a couple things about taxiing the airplane. It will, as soon as you take the parking brake off at low idle, she's going to want to start to roll, which is fine. It is a tailwheel airplane, so when you hit the brakes, she may tend to nose forward slightly. So you just got to be aware of that. So the fluids and temperatures, or pressures and temperatures are all up. So we're going to bring the throttles back. We will come off on the parking brake. Bring up the throttle slightly. I'm going to give her a little bit of a right-hand turn here, and we'll get her going. It does take a little bit sometimes to get her to taxi or to start rolling. If you find you're getting stuck, just tap the brakes. It's usually enough to release her. You always want to try to keep the speed down a little bit. it is a little bit hard to see when taxiing if you're inside, and it will get away from you on the corners if you're going too fast. The tail will just flip around. Speaking of which, if you are inside, as you can see, it's a little awkward to see out the nose, and if you go up, it's still a bit awkward because you do have that huge engine sitting right in front of you. So you may wish to taxi from outside. So we're going to pull up to the hold short line here, and then we're going to run through the checks that you would do prior to taking off. And there we go. So we are stopped. Put on the parking brake. So the first thing you would do when you get here, you'd face into the wind, and you're going to do the engine run-ups. Again, these are older radial engines, cylinders, and stuff, so you have to run up the engine to make sure everything is working. I'll show you how to do that with one of them, and then I'm not going to do all three, but you would do each one on its own. So the first one we're going to do is, we'll do the right-hand engine, engine number 3. That's the one we started first. So we're going to come over here. We're going to take the RPM propeller gauge, and we're going to go all the way to high RPM, and then we're going to bring the engine up to about 1500 RPM, and we'll let the engine stabilize there. And what this is doing is bringing all the pressures up. It's bringing up to kind of operating speed. We want to try to get it to 1500 RPM and just sit right on the line as close as we can, because we're going to need to be able to refer to that. So about there. First thing we're going to do is make sure it's all stable. So we're going to look at our oil temperature, oil pressure. You can see they've moved up. Pressures and temperatures have come up. Fuel pressure is up because the engine's now running and it's generating enough pressure. Cylinder head temperature is just starting to rise. You can see it there. And oops, down here on the this is the exhaust gas temperature. You can see that's coming up as well. So that is all looking good. First thing we want to check is the magnetos. So you can see we're pretty much right on the line there. So what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to the right hand magneto itself, by itself. That is 2 clicks over, and we should get a slight RPM drop. You can see it there. We'll then go back to both. It should come up, and there we go. And then we'll go to the second magneto. We should get a similar drop, and the total drop shouldn't add up to more than about 100 RPM, 125 RPM. So that looks good. We'll bring that back up. Excellent. So that is working very well. Basically, these cylinders have 2 banks of spark plugs. Each one is on a separate electrical system or magneto, so that if there's a failure on one magneto, you only lose one of the 2 spark plugs. The engine will still work on the other one. Not as well, but it will work, and that's what you're checking to make sure that it works sufficiently well on each one. So they're both working fine. What we're then going to do is we're going to cycle the prop. You can see it shifting around there on the RPMs. That means the prop is running through its stuff. It's going coarser and finer as you would do for flight. And that's what you want to see. You want to see that adjustment up and down. That means it's getting harder to turn the prop, and it means the blade is cycling properly. The last one you would do, and we'll get that up to that temperature there, while we're on the idle, is you do your carb heat. And what that is you would crank the gauge all the way around, and you would start introducing that warm air into the carburetor. And while that will get rid of ice in the carb if you have buildup, what it will also do is drop the RPM, because the airplane likes cold air. So you can see there it's dropped the RPM a little bit, which is what you'd want to see, and then you'd want to crank that around again and you should find that your temperature gauge comes back to normal, and you can see my RPMs coming up again. Last step we're going to do is we're going to reduce the power all the way to full idle, like so. Now the engine shouldn't quit, but she should drop down to about 550 RPMs, so maybe 600. There you go. It's down to about 500 RPMs, that's good. And then what we would do would bring it back up and match out with the others. And bring that back up and let her stabilize. And that's what we would do for each of the engines. Bring that back down to low. So that would be, all of our engines would be done that way, and that would bring us up to ensuring the engines all work properly, and we have everything all warmed up and they're at the right temperatures. Of course, this one's now going to be hot because we've run it up a little bit higher, so it's going to read out of whack. Next, we're going to come down to here. We're going to set the radios. So first thing we're doing is going to go over to normal on a radio master, and we're going to be using this radio. I'm going to set the Unicom channel 122.80, and then down here you've got the I think that's the on and volume switch, but it doesn't show anything moving. So here you get your turning on the decimals, and here's your whole numbers, same as on this side. Atc Transponder we'll leave at 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to turn that to on now, or actually we'll go altitude reporting. We do have an ident button here if we need it. For our nav radio, I've got the approach where we're coming in pulled in. There is a VOR at the airport. It's 116.2. But we're also going to use the ADF needle. So there is only one ADF, and it has to show up on 1. So we're going to use nav 2 for this VOR. So it is 116.2, so we're going to go 0.2, and we'll go to the big dial. We'll go to the big dial here, 116, and we want it on nav. And then for the ADF, there's a beacon of 290. So this has a couple different dials, so it can go fairly quickly. We've got a middle one that does that number and a far one that does that number, or a tiny one. So 290, and we're going to turn this to ADF. So that is now set up. We come down here, turn our taxi light on, turn our nav and strobe on. We can turn on our left and right landing lights. They are independent. We're also going to come down to here. We're going to turn our pitot heats on. And the only thing we have now is fuel pressure because the engines are at idle. Tank selector is still on both, which is fine. That's where we want it. And we are almost ready to go. So we're going to come down to the gauge here. We're going to go 1 notch a flap for takeoff. There we go. And for trim, we're going to dial our trim up to about positive 1.8. And now it should allow the airplane basically to fly itself off the runway. Nice and smooth. Now it will vary a little bit with weight and balance and all that type of stuff. Where your weights are, but that will do that. One last thing I want to talk about on weight and balance is to be aware that I think the trim is slightly out on this airplane. So what I find is no matter what your load is, and it's just the cabin crew, cockpit crew right now, and I'm at 60% fuel, which is why it was reading 6 on the gauge. You want to adjust your center of gravity so that this is centered. So what I'm going to do is grab it, and I'm just going to move it until it's nice and centered like that. You can see that there. That will make the airplane balance a little bit better, especially with the trim forces. I find if you don't do that, she tends to want a lot of trim, a lot more than it really should. And there we go. We are ready to fly. So we're going to leave you there. Next video, we're going to do the takeoff, climb, and cruise. Hope this has been helpful with you getting started in the Ju-52. And we will see you in the next one. Bye for now.